الرحمن الرحيم.
Hello and Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to Atiyah on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing show on Ramadan Radio Wolverhampton, online on ramadanradiowolves.com. In the previous show, our guest, Dr. Cindy Plehel, provided insight into her role as a Macmillan counselling psychologist. She shared mental health support available for service users, patients and carers, as well as sharing wellbeing tips that we could all take away for use. For example, the ART acronym, creating activities, focusing on routine and recognising triggers. You can listen back to this on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further mental health information on my Twitter feed at Atiyah Ali3. In the show today, we hope to provide information that may be helpful to support our well-being and the well-being of others. Within the last week or so, the celebration of Windrush Day brought attention to celebrating the Windrush generation's invaluable contribution to Britain. The day itself was created by the current government following their Windrush scandal, which many of you may already be aware of. At present, with ongoing Black Lives Matter concerns and an increased impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities, mental health and emotional well-being of these communities requires extra focus and attention during these challenging times. It is suggested that Black people are 4 times more likely to be detained and more likely to be restrained and isolated under the outdated Mental Health Act. Today, the focus on Black Lives Matter is to allow us to understand the current added impact on well-being during lockdown for, in particular, Afro-Caribbean communities. In the show today, we have 2 guests that will discuss this further. Can I remind you that we won't be taking calls within the show? However, we welcome questions or comments via our WhatsApp messaging number on 07 440 420 432. You can message with your name or anonymously on 07 440 420 432, and I will try my best to share your comments or questions. I'd like to now welcome our first guest, Junie Mohammed, who works as a Community Development Service Manager and Director of Spiritual and Pastoral Care in Mental Health. Welcome to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show, Junie.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming and thank you for giving up your time this afternoon. Now, Junie, most of the listeners are probably aware of Black Lives Matter. Others are becoming more aware in recent months, and some still have no idea what the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement is. What are the reasons for the recent media coverage and focus? I realise we probably need more time to answer this question, but please can you help shed some light on this?
Yes. Good afternoon, radio listening audience. Assalamu alaikum. One of the things that really brought Black Lives Matter to a head was the unfortunate killing of George Floyd and the visual showing of his death, of his murder on screen, on TV, on a global stage, and the showing of his death by the law enforcement at that time shocked the world. And in that shock and horror of treatment from one human being to another, allowed the Black Lives Matter movement to enable people to share their voices of people who also was killed and murdered. They were able to share their stories of injustice and disadvantage across the globe. So the Black Lives Matter was about creating a platform and a movement to give voice and highlight that this George Floyd's death allowed the world to see and hear about his death, the impact on the community and their lives. It exposed many things within the different systemic and institutional racial issues. But many different people who are disadvantaged and experience all type of racism and discrimination in the world have now brought their stories to the forefront of where there's no closure, where they didn't feel there was justice, where they didn't feel nobody wanted to know, where they still going to push for things to be opened up. Because talking about racism is very, very difficult for society where racism is a social construct, and historically racism is a part of a bigger systemic social and economic practice, unfortunately, that the world has experienced and participated in. So Black Lives Matter is really about not saying all lives don't matter, but ensuring that, well, what about the Black life? What about the disproportionate issues that people face and fear on a day-to-day basis all over the world? And there's a saying, you know, if you adjust and address the issue of race inequality or race inequity, you actually address those behaviours for all of society. So Black Lives Movement has been very important at this time, but they're not the only ones that have talked about these issues, but they have been brought to the forefront at this time. So I hope that answered that question.
Thank you. No, Junie, it's very insightful. Thank you very much. Junie, so understandably, like you've shared, and most of us are aware, you know, we have seen the horrific act and leading to George Floyd's death, and that has had an impact on everyone's well-being. I mean, no one has liked to watch that. I'm wondering whether, you know, this attention and understanding the impact of mental health of Black people, Afro-Caribbean people, it is necessary at the moment, and we're sure about that. But what are your thoughts about this in terms of impact on the mental health of Afro-Caribbean people or Black people?
I think, really, you know, the impact on our mental health is severe, and it is already re-stimulated existing trauma that it sits in the DNA of African people who were stolen or kidnapped and taken against their will, and had their name, their language, their culture, their religion, their way of being robbed and denied them for over 400 years.
Wow.
So Dr. Joy Jigru or O'Leary, I can't pronounce her name properly,
Right.
but she talks about the post-slave syndrome. So there's a post-traumatic slave syndrome in the DNA of those living and descendants who survived slavery, but literally still have the legacy of that trauma in their DNA,
Right.
that never had any treatment. It's never been acknowledged. It's denied. So even in the way that you see the system, how it's organized, is the trauma faced on a day-to-day basis of this particular community. It's not the only community, but we're talking specifically about the African Caribbean community.
Okay.
What is that trauma that exists that is not actually being addressed in any therapeutic system or setting in mainstream services? We need to understand this because it's never actually been acknowledged. So the everyday experiences and behaviors Black people had to endure, saying you've got a chip on your shoulder, that doesn't matter, or it's ignored, and it's skipped past in any assessment of you telling your story. So the impact, can you imagine seeing George die, people filming, people assisting in his death, the horror that has stirred up, the fear, the anxiety, triggered people's physical health to become unwell, to not feel safe, to not feel secure, and all of those types of mental health impacts, even in the workplace, are not new impacts, but watching and seeing that moment has steered and stirred this deep trauma that has not ever been acknowledged. As a people, they have never, ever received any acknowledgement or treatment for the dehumanization that they experience. So what that looks like now when you're talking about the impact of mental health, can you imagine experiencing defensive colleagues who they too have seen what you've seen, but they're still defending their position, or who don't understand the impact of having this trauma reignited in or exacerbated because the Black community, and when you look at the Race Equality Act that people died for, and then they had diversity, and then they had the only, the Single Equality Act. Then they brought out the Equality Act 2010. They still had to have a workforce race equality standard put in place in the National Health Service, because race would always fall off. So the impact of not being able to talk about who you are, your experience in your own identity, to deny your own voice, to deny your own experience to deny your other colleagues that look like you, to deny your everyday fear whether your child will come home safely or not. How to debrief your children being stopped and searched, your husband being stopped and searched. There was one man, he worked in one of the local councils in South London, and he was stopped over 68 times in 1 year. And one of the senior white officers of that council watched one day as he was being arrested and stopped and did nothing. So it's the mental health is to do with the humiliation.
Right.
And like, oh, it's okay for you to experience that because, you know, you're black people, so you should just, you know, experience that. That's what, you know, you should accept and, you know, just say nothing. And we certainly don't want you to complain about it.
And
So
Afro-Caribbean people, African, Afro-Caribbean communities who experience this anxiety on a daily basis must be wondering whether mental health services will be able to provide support for them and taking into regards this generational trauma, some might refer to it as, and whether they're able to get the right support at the right time. Now, I want to pick up on this on the other side of the break, if that's okay, and we're shortly going into a break. So hopefully we'll pick up on this and looking at understanding what kind of mental health support is available for people of African and Afro-Caribbean communities, as well as other Black Asian. Hello and welcome back to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing show on Ramadan Radio Wolverhampton. You can message into this show with your name or anonymously on 07 440 420 432, and I'll try my best to share your comments or questions. Welcome back, Junie. Junie, during the break we've had a couple of questions which have a similar theme, I feel, and although we were going to pick up on mental health services and how people can understand the support that is available. Perhaps I could pick that up later in the show with Layla. But these questions here now, I feel, it's right only to give some time to them. However, one of the questions are a little bit personal, so it's up to you if you want to answer this. This person has messaged in, Salam, excellent topic to discuss. Has June experienced institutional racism in her role? Hello, June, are you with me?
Okay, that's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
In my role, I work in health and a large health organisation, and we need to really accept that all institutions are institutionally racist. The structure and the design of them doesn't matter whether whether you work at the Parliament or you work in NHS or the police force or wherever you work. The structure and the design of them are institutionally racist, unfortunately. And how you experience it is the common things around career progression, the numbers of grievance you have to put in because of the ways that behaviours are interpreted with a bias. You're more likely to be disciplined. And I think those are the key things that you experience. You're what's the word? You're looked over. I just feel that you're not seen as who the organisation wants to choose to represent at a certain level. And how I experience it is how the majority of people experience it, that they get stuck at a certain level, and you end up having to train other people to be your seniors, and you take a lot longer. And one of my colleagues, I will just share this before we move on, she came in and she was at a level 4, and she said to me, one of our managers was at the same level, and now he's at a level 9, and my colleague is at a level 6. So she went up 2 grades, but our white senior counterpart was able to go up 5, 6 grades, and so that for her was a real marker of the difference in opportunity and lack of opportunity to really represent your organisation at a senior level. So I'll leave that one there. I hope that answers that question. But it's the same even when you go out to meetings. I could be in places where I'm having to make sure that I pick up on the inequality and disadvantage, when other people may have that as a part of their role and their hat, but they don't do that. So those are, some of the different types of dynamics. Or you may notice, I don't know in your area, but when you're having cuts in the large organisations and local authorities, you will find the cuts adversely and disproportionately will affect Black, Asian and minority communities more so than other communities. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? So I'll leave that one there.
Yeah, and all of what you are talking about there has an impact on individuals' emotional well-being. And the next couple of questions in line with what we've just been talking about is from a caller, Celandine. Thank you for messaging in. There's a couple of messages from her. She's asking, what support do you feel should be offered to BAME, that's Black, Asian, minority, ethnic staff, when working within a workplace in this current climate? And she goes on to ask, when being faced with institutionalized racism, how do you tackle and deal with it? So this is looking at emotional well-being support from staff rather than services. And with your background in community development, please do.
I've got it. Oh, those are really good questions. Thank you, caller, for ringing in with those questions. Very important. A part of the work that I'm offering at the moment is looking at bereavement and loss, because during this COVID-19 pandemic, we have noticed from our lived experience that you may have come into contact with people who have lost loved ones. You yourself may have lost family members and friends, disproportionately more so than some of your other colleagues. So we've offered a safe space for people to check in once a week, that they can have an opportunity to talk about bereavement and loss, because the impact of losing someone in a time where your normal customary ways of responding to loss has been lost, and people can't get to bury their loved ones in the way they would like to. They can't respond to their family members or their friends or their neighbours in the ways that they would customarily do. And not being able to go to the graveside, maybe 5 of you or 10 of you, depends on your cemetery, just waving a hearse bye-bye, and you can't go. You can't pour dirt on the coffin. All of these things, or people can't travel to bury their loved ones abroad. Just all of those things around bereavement, and how you would revere, your grandmother or your great-grandmother in the celebration of life. Many staff have felt that they've shortchanged their family by not giving them the send-off that they deserve, and that is expected, culturally expected. And they feel quite disturbed and very tearful. And when they're serving their customers, listening to the tales also of the customers that have lost and how to support them, and their self, being constantly like re-triggered, having to cope with their own grief and the grief of the many people that they serve. So staff need to be able to talk about their loss in the team meeting.
So allowing some space within services for managers, supervisors to offer this. Julie, we are running towards we're coming towards the end of this segment, and I just wanted to quickly ask really about mental health services and services that are probably available for specifically African and Afro-Caribbean communities. Are you aware of any? And I know that you work with On Track.
Yes, so I work with a project called On Track. That's www.ontrackproject, and that's specifically looking at African and African Caribbean people, Black people, and mental health. And there's a research project going on, and we're also promoting good mental health and good messages, and better understanding of how best to support this community. As you said at the start of the show, who are 14 times more likely to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They're more likely to enter into mental health services in crisis, and they're more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And that act has actually changed during this COVID time, that you don't need two senior officers to section somebody anymore. You only need one. So the police and mental services have different powers during COVID time, and I think we need to be aware of that. But what I would say is go to your local what they call it, your local, what do they call them? Watch groups. What are they called?
Sorry, I'm unsure what you mean. Watch for.
There's an organisation, and they listen to the community. Their name will come back to me in a minute.
Well, feel free to message us in later with that name, Junie.
I will do.
Thank you.
But just very quickly to say, all local authorities are working with their local clinical commissioning groups and health and wellbeing boards.
Right.
And they should have a list of both statutory mental health services and local voluntary and community sector services. Right. Now, I know in Wolverhampton you had lost a Black specific mental health service, and I'm not aware of any that is left in that area. However, you should still have support groups, but you will have to find them on the listing and just actually put them in the Google, and you will find them there.
And a lot of services are offering online support at the moment, aren't they? So it doesn't necessarily have to be in your area.
Absolutely, you can get online support. I'm more than happy to support people. Myself, I have my own website, www.frontroomtherapy.com. So please email me there.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you,
And
Junie Mohammed. Thank you very much for taking time away from your busy schedule and helping us understand current issues that may be having an impact on individuals within the Black Asian minority ethnic community, as well as providing insight into kind of community development and support that is
I've got one
provided.
thing to say
Go on.
before I go.
Mm-hmm.
That as a community, we can do more to help ourselves and our own mental health. We need to make sure we're getting good sleep.
Mm-hmm.
We are
Layla will be picking up on these points,
well,
Junie, in a minute.
and we are being mindful in our own practice. And I will say this to everybody: seek peace. Seek peace with yourself, your inner self. Make time to listen to yourself and calm your body and your mind.
Thank you, Junie.
Find peace and ask for support where you need it from your family and your friends.
Absolutely.
Do not suffer in silence, and allow others to walk with you when you go to seek help. Don't be alone. That's what I would say. Don't be alone.
Thank you very much again, Junie. Wish you
Take
all
care.
the best in your endeavours. Thank you. Do stay tuned in to listen to our next guest, who will introduce herself in a short while. I'm going to inform our listeners of research that you may be able to get involved in, or inform someone who can get involved in this research. Okay, so thank you to all of you for tuning in so far today. Do stay tuned. I've been sent some information by Tiffany Rameswari, who is training to be a psychologist and is currently doing her doctoral research on Black men's experiences with masculinity, which is what it means to be a man and how this influences getting help for depression. In her studies so far, she has seen how Black men, compared to men from other races and backgrounds, are the least likely to get help. Yet there can be a substantially high incidences of experiencing depression and suicidality amongst Black men. It might also be that Black men have their own form of masculinity, Black masculinity, which is important to distinguish from other forms of masculinity. So therefore, Tiffany is looking to gain insight directly from those Black men who have had help for depression, to see how other Black men can also do so, if their form of masculinity is stopping them. So if you're a Black British man of African Caribbean descent who'd be willing to talk about your experiences, Tiffany would like to hear from you. Please contact her or email her on tiffany.rameswari, that's RAMESWARI @city.ac.uk, or you can phone her on 077 29 789 832. Any contact made will be confidential. Excuse me. Can I remind you that we won't be taking calls for the show. However, we welcome questions or comments on 07440 420 432. I believe now we have our next guest on the line today. Layla Lawton is a cognitive behaviour psychotherapist and a part-time lecturer. She's worked in mental health for many years. She has a strong passion for increasing cultural sensitivity within mental health services and is also a member of the British Association for Behavioural and Cognitive Psychotherapies, Equality and Cultural Special Interest Group, where I have personally had the pleasure to meet Layla. Layla, welcome to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing Show on Ramadan Radio Wolverhampton. Can you hear me, Layla? Hello? I believe that Layla is on the call, but we cannot hear you, Layla. Are you on mute by any chance? Okay, so if I end the call and if you could call back in, Layla, that'd be great. Right, so thank you for all of you who are still tuning in. We're going to try and get Layla back on into the studio. As I've mentioned earlier, it's very important for people to get involved in research. There's research within mental health focusing on different Black, Asian, minority and ethnic communities. And let's try Layla again. Hello, Layla. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. We can hear you too now. Thank you for coming onto the show. I don't know if
Thank
you
you.
heard your introduction.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. So, Layla, as you may have heard,
Yes.
earlier in the show, the recent added focus on Black Lives Matter concerns has had an impact on the well-being of African and Afro-Caribbean communities. Why do you think this is so? Sorry, why do you think this might be the
So
case?
the graphic images and videos of barbaric and evil practices at the hands of an establishment meant to protect the lives of the community are not new. So George Floyd died at the hands of the police as the world watched. Ahmaud Arbery shot whilst exercising in February by members of the public who suspected that he had or was committing a crime. His assailants were arrested 2 months later. Breonna Taylor was killed by police. In March, they entered her home unannounced. Boyfriend, who was a licensed gun holder, shot in self-defense, and she was actually shot. She was unarmed 8 times. There were multiple inaccuracies in the police accounts and failings in their operations. Wrong place, wrong time, in your bed. And these accounts aren't new. And this was happening here in the backdrop of a rapidly emerging pandemic, which saw a rapid increase in deaths, which now exceeds 65,000, with the majority of those affected from ethnic communities. Where the consumption of social media as a way of connecting and communicating is also heightened. Somehow the camera lens has become magnified, and it's penetrated hearts and also consciousness in a way that we've not seen before, because the injustice of inequality within our systems and structures has been prevalent throughout for decades, for centuries. Our colonial past highlights that, and so I think at a time when everyone was watching, only connected using these means, these images have been magnified in a way that's really important. And different reverends have been saying, let this be more than a moment and let it be a movement. Because actually the fact that Black lives have been targeted is because there's a process of othering, where there's a bias, where there's a sense of threat or danger when you see a Black male or a Black person. And that's a lot to do with media portrayals. It's a lot to do with historical context. For many years, the world has become desensitized to these images, accepting of the status quo that suggests that Black people are more likely to have poor outcomes in education, employment, live in areas with the most deprivation, be detained under the Mental Health Act, as Sheenie was saying, in prison, and experience severe and enduring mental health difficulties. So it represents something that has been a systematic and structural issue for many years that we've all had to live with. But in a way now, it's just making various things happen over the years, Stephen Lawrence, for us in this country. But there have been many deaths in police custody that we don't know about, The figures are mounting. And someone used the analogy that in explaining Black Lives Matter was that if one house on the street is burning down, then you approach that house first to put the fire out. But the truth is that house has been burning for decades and centuries. And there are numerous papers that evidence overrepresentation of BME, of Black people specifically in prisons and secure institutions, and just the poor outcomes. So it's a heavy weight. It's
Absolutely.
a heavy weight here. Even just reflecting back on it myself as a Black, British, African, or Ugandan therapist to be more specific, with many intersectional layers. It's a heavy weight.
And with the addition of this current circumstances with COVID-19, the lockdown, and for some listeners, perhaps Islamophobia, what are your thoughts about the kind of mental health support that people can get and might need?
Well, I think support needs to be accessible and culturally congruent. And working closely with the Equality and Culture SIG, there's a big move to kind of support compulsory implementation of the BABCP BAME Positive Practice Guide, which is very holistic in looking at areas in improving access, improving outcomes and experience, improving community engagement, and improving the workforce so it's more representative of the population it serves. But this work is ongoing, and it needs to be funded. It needs to be taken more seriously. It's founded in evidence, and because unfortunately at the moment we aren't represented in services at the early point, like improving access to psychological therapies, which is available in every borough. So I think it's, to answer your question, I think it's a two-pronged response, because I think a movement of empowerment is required locally, which can grow and influence nationally. So I think people need to have time, first of all, to just process what's happening, and to just kind of come to terms with their own traumas. And for me personally, it's been very emotional and continues to be. And I think in the first instance, self-care and self-preservation is important. We put our own gas masks on first, take time out, be with family, connect with people who mean something to you and who can remind you of your identity, connect with your faith, know your identity. For me, my identity is in Christ. And, you know, to really hold on to that and get anchored into that, spiritual connections and rest, and then think, actually, how can I influence in my workplace? How can I influence in my home? Educating our families, educating our children, educating our communities, but without the burden of it being on us, because sometimes education is just, it can be done in a very natural way, because I think a lot of people are also being saying that we don't want to feel like it's our responsibility to have to educate people, but the problem is the curriculum does need decolonizing, because unless you grow up in an ethnic household, I remember being taught about Malcolm X, about Martin Luther King, about the segregation and everything that was happening in America and across the world, and the way that countries were colonized, taken over with the aim of kind of bringing in civilization. But they don't tell you that these countries and places were perhaps already civilized and had their own processes and structures, because it's all about economy and power and wealth. And so a lot of countries like within Africa have been stripped of a lot of things, but yet Africa is in debt. Yet what has been taken from Africa as a continent is far more than what Africa owes to any establishment, to any country. So this is the historical layers of trauma which we sit upon. And I think collectively, it's not just if we seek mental health support, we also need to seek a way of getting change, because if you don't trust the systems and structures that are there, you're not going to receive that support. We need to be working better with the communities. We need to be co-located. I believe that therapists should be co-located within communities. We should be learning from the communities that we're serving, and we should be producing an evidence base that is more representative of the communities that we're serving.
Yeah, sounds like fantastic ideas that can
basically. So I would say people do go to your local AT, but make sure that they're implementing the BME Positive Practice Guide. Ask about it. People should be receiving therapy that's culturally sensitive and culturally adapted. But what we're seeing is that actually is an overhaul, and even in clinical training and even within establishments where people are being supervised, we're recognising there's a need to do better in terms of providing education on cultural competence, which is a lifelong pursuit, but also just understanding implicit and explicit bias and just racist infrastructure that we are living and embedded within, you know, because fundamentally, if we don't get that, then we can't make the change and increase access. People won't feel that they can trust the services that are there.
Right,
we need to address the systemic issues, I think.
This brings me on to the next question, which earlier we talked with Junie about the historical context, and you've added to that. Thank you very much. But in the here and now, in terms of current experiences, in light of the current news, some psychotherapists or psychologists are worried, in fact, that previous experiences of racism might be re-traumatized for individuals, re-experienced. What do we mean by this? What do they mean by this?
So basically, I'm going to summarise a lot of points made by Dr. Juliet McClendon, who summarised this really well. So they're referring to the reminders of previous traumas triggered by these recent unjustified events. So vicarious trauma, many experiences that Black, Indigenous and people of colour do not fall into the types of trauma that would garner a PTSD diagnosis. For example, being regularly exposed to social media of the murder of Black people is not considered trauma for the average person, as it's part of your job and it's repetitive. You're a journalist. So PTSD is a mental disorder. It's caused by experiencing a traumatic event. So the diagnostic manual is very specific about what types of events are considered traumatic. So it's characterised by 4 clusters of symptoms: re-experiencing, nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance. Racial stress and trauma is not in the diagnostic manual. People definitely can experience PTSD after experiencing a racist event, but that event has to include actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Fundamentally, these are all quite new terms, and I think because people haven't been able to express and recognise and acknowledge what this is, perhaps new terms in this climate, but I think America's ahead of us with Dr. Williams doing some fantastic work out there. So it's the exposure to multiple microaggressions or experiences where people can be subtle or covert or overt in their racism, and it just builds up over time. And for us, actually, the images of these deaths, they've been repetitive over this period of time. The injustice has been absolutely abhorrent and unbelievable. So there's influences of like cultural trauma, overt and covert racism, and then there could be many traumatizing events within that, and the people don't receive validation for that because they're not receiving the right support, and it just becomes part and parcel, and we just have to cope and we just have to survive. And then, as Jeannie was talking about, the institutional racism and the barriers to treatment, and then we as a workforce and as the NHS have a responsibility to make sure that there's equity of access and equity of experience and outcomes for all.
Absolutely, Layla. On that note,
do better with Black and Asian and other minority ethnic communities.
Thank you so much, Layla, for your short contribution to the show. But it has been very informative, and people can listen back to this on our YouTube channel. A reminder to all to take about taking part in important research that contributes to providing knowledge for supporting the development of services and the practice of mental health and the experience for service users. Junie has messaged into the show to say that if you contact your local health watch organisation, they will be able to provide you with a list of local NHS and non-NHS services that you can access. So please do look at this. You will hear me on the first weekend of every month. Thank you very much for listening in today. Stay